The stories in this lecture are larger than life. We're jumping into the 20th century for tall tales and folk songs. And what's fascinating about these stories is how they create the idea of larger-than-life characters doing extraordinary things. Tall tales often reinforce the dominant ideals of the culture out of which they spring. In this case, 20th century American tall tales, the stories often carry themes of expansion, colonization, progress, and taming the wilderness. Ballads and folk songs often served as a way for working-class folks to speak back to the speed and the force and the onward rush of industrialization and progress. So there's a lot that these stories tell us, not only about the dominant values of history, but how those values rubbed up against a different way of life at the time. Tall tales and folk songs give us a way to speak about our history and to speak back to that history. Let's start with a whopper of a tale about Pecos Bill. Pecos Bill's family was traveling across the plains, headed out west to settle new land and build a new life for themselves. But as the wagon bumped along, Bill squeezed out the back of the wagon and boom, landed on the dirt, while the wagon and the rest of his family rode creaking away across the plains. Well, there he was, lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut, when along came a coyote. And this particular coyote was friendly to little children. So she picked him up by the scruff of the neck and took him back to her den where Pecos Bill was raised as a coyote, scratching fleas and chasing food and howling at the moon. One day, Bill was loping along when he came across the strangest-looking critter. It had 2 legs, gangly side parts, and no tail in the back. And when it spoke to him, it told Bill it was a cowboy. The cowboy gave Pecos Bill some cowboy clothes, being neighborly, and along Bill walked. And he hadn't gotten far when along came a rattlesnake. A big, fat, long, angry rattlesnake just sunning itself there on a rock. "Well, lucky you came along. I was needing a rope," he said. And Bill reached over, bound it up at his side, and it became his rope. He was getting to look like a real cowboy now, but he realized he also needed something to ride. So he went on up into the hills and jumped on the back of a cougar. Hi-yah! And off they rode, meeting up with other cowboys and driving cattle across the plains of Kansas. Until one day, the sky grew dark. The air grew unnatural still, and off in the distance, Pecos Bill saw a swirling, whirling funnel of wind, dark and terrible against the horizon, and the thing was headed right for them, tearing up houses, picking up cows, and throwing every tree in its path this way and that. But Bill, he wasn't worried. He just took out his snake rope, lassoed the tornado, for that's what it was, and drug that twister down out of the sky. But the cyclone wouldn't hold still. So Pecos Bill, he hopped on the back of that cyclone and started to woo-wee, ride that cyclone like it was a bucking bronco needing to be tamed. And he squeezed harder and harder on that rope around that cyclone, and that cyclone, woo-hoo-hoo-hoo, it started to cry, and big salty tears dropped down, and they became the Great Salt Lake. On they rode, Pecos Bill, woo-wee, on the back of that rope twister, whirling and bucking and fussing up a storm. Up and up Bill started to steer it, up into the clouds, riding that twister of furious wind. And that is the last that anybody ever saw of Pecos Bill in these parts. Now, do you think that really happened? No, of course it didn't. But it sure is fun to hear, isn't it? In West Virginia, there is an annual liars contest in which people make up their own tall tales and tell them in the most believable manner they can. You know what you're hearing could never happen in a million years, but it sure is fun to think about it. Tall tales take joy in excess. If life in a classroom or a boardroom seems to contain us, tall tales let us expand, let loose, be free. Pecos Bill's superhuman strength and abilities are larger than life, which is fitting with the experiences that settlers had, suddenly moving from cramped city quarters into the wide western landscape. And there's a kind of creative power in stories about excess. Tall tales let us explore what if. What if I could go out and survive in the wilderness? And like all folk tales, tall tales sprung up out of a culture from a certain context. Pecos Bill was a tall tale hero in the Wild West who stood for the values of survival, and he also is a symbol for conquering the American West and the Native Americans who lived there. So our tall tale heritage can be complicated. Let's look at another example. Davy Crockett, like many other tall tale heroes, was a real person. He was a Tennessee, where I'm from, a Tennessee militia colonel, and a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, we know him best in folklore as the backwoodsman who wore a coonskin cap. Now, right around the time when Davy died, and for several years afterwards, from 1835 to 41, in Nashville, raconteurs published stories about Davy Crockett and about his wife, Sally Ann Whirlwind, and other tall tale women in Davy Crockett's Almanac. One of the many fascinating parts about these stories is how they portray women. In the context of the time, women in the 1850s were expected to be demure and genteel, but the women in these stories, they are fantastically fierce. Take a listen to Katie Goodgrit. Katie Goodgrit were a favorite of mine, because when her spunk were up, she could grin a wildcat out of countenance and make a streak of lightning back out. She didn't care for anything that went on 4 legs, nor anything that went on 2 legs. One day, she was going out into the woods and seed 2 wolves shying around, along like a snake in the grass, not a great ways off. And she determined to put a stop to them, for they looked very obnoxious and seemed to be wanting to taste something of the human kind. So she took up a club and walked in between them. They begun to feel amazing skittish when they seed her coming with that club, but at last they came towards her. She gave one of them a monstrous tap on the head with her club, and he squawked right out. Before she had time to hit the other, she heard a pattering amongst the leaves, and when she looked around, there were about 50 wolves coming toward her on the full trot. Some gals would have been scared out of their wits, but Katie, she knowed it was the first duty of a gal of Kaintuck to stand up to her lick log, salt or no salt. So she just squatted low for the present and got up into a holler stump where those wolves couldn't quite reach her. And they come roaring around her, like the water boiling around Crocodile Rock at Tumbledown Falls. They jumped up even most to her face, and she spit at one so violent that it knocked his eye out. She caught another by the scruff of the neck and whipped his head off again the tree, so she kept stopping their wind, till the first she knew there were a pile of dead wolves around the tree, high enough for the others to climb on. Then she were obliged to squat down, or they would have tore her head off. She stayed there all night. But early next morning, she stuck up her head and crowed, till she crowed and screamed all the wolves deaf. And then they begun to clear off. But she went after 'em with a pole and killed half of 'em before they got away. Frontiers women like Katie Goodgrit were as fierce as Pecos Bill, and the almanacs are full of stories about these women who tamed bears and wrestled crocodiles, tied rattlesnakes together to make a rope, and wore a hornet's nest for a hat. These weren't dainty Victorian women. These were the tall-tale versions of real women, like Annie Oakley, who was a real woman sharpshooter, who traveled to 14 different countries, entertained royalty, and spoke up for women's rights, saying, "I would like to see every woman know how to handle guns as naturally as they know how to handle babies." During World War I, Annie Oakley offered to train up a troop of women sharpshooters, but President Roosevelt wouldn't let her. Along with Pecos Bill and Davy Crockett, Katie Goodgrit, and Annie Oakley, Paul Bunyan is arguably the most famous character in American folklore. Let's hear his story and then learn more about its history. Babe, the big blue ox, constituted Paul Bunyan's assets and liabilities. Now, history disagrees as to when, where, and how Paul first acquired this bovine locomotive, but its subsequent record is reliably established. Babe could pull anything that had two ends to it. Babe was 7 axe handles wide between the eyes, according to some authorities. Others equally dependable say 42 axe handles and a plug of tobacco. 7 of Paul's axe handles were equal to a little more than 42 of the ordinary kind. Now, when cost sheets were figured on Babe, Johnny Inkslinger found that upkeep and overhead were expensive, but the efficiency was very high. Now, how else could Paul have hauled logs to the landing, a whole section, 640 acres at a time? Now, he also used Babe to pull the kinks out of the crooked logging roads, and it was a job of this kind that Babe pulled a chain of 3-inch links out into a straight bar. They could never keep Babe more than one night at camp, for he would eat in one day all the feed one crew could tote to camp in a year. For a snack in between meals, he would eat 50 bales of hay, wire and all, and 6 men with pickaroons were kept busy picking the wire out of his teeth. Babe was a great pet, and very docile as a general thing, but he seemed to have a sense of humor and frequently got into mischief. He would sneak up behind a drive and drink up all the water out of that river, leaving the logs high and dry. It was impossible to build an ox sling big enough to hoist Babe off the ground for shoeing. But after they logged off Dakota, there was room for Babe to lie down for this operation. Once in a while, Babe would run away and be gone all day, roaming all over the northwestern country. His tracks were so far apart that it was impossible to follow him, and so deep that a man falling into one could only be hauled out with difficulty and a long rope. Once a settler and his wife and baby fell into one of these tracks, and the son got out when he was 57 years old and reported the accident. These tracks today form the thousands of lakes in the land of the sky blue water. Paul worked all hours of the day and night, and he invented the tools of all lumberjacks. And all of Paul's inventions were successful, except when he decided to run 3 10-hour shifts a day and installed the Aurora Borealis. After a number of trials, the plan was abandoned because the lights were not dependable. Paul's lumberjack friend, Chris Crosshall, was a careless cuss. He took a big drive down the Mississippi for Paul, and when the logs were delivered in the New Orleans boom, it was found that he had driven the wrong logs. The owners looked at the bark marks and refused to accept them. It was up to Paul to drive them back upstream. No one but Paul Bunyan would ever tackle a job like that. To drive logs upstream is impossible. But if you think a little thing like an impossibility would stop him, well, you don't know Paul Bunyan. He simply fed Babe a good big salt ration and drove him to the upper Mississippi to drink. Babe drank the river dry and sucked all the water upstream. The logs came up the river faster than they ever went down. If Paul Bunyan did not invent geography, well, he created a lot of it. The Great Lakes were first constructed to provide a watering hole for Babe, the big blue ox. The winter Paul Bunyan logged off North Dakota, he hauled water for his ice roads from the Great Lakes. One day when Brimstone Bill had Babe hitched to one of the old water tanks and was making his early morning trip, the tank sprung a leak. When they were halfway across Minnesota, Bill saved himself from drowning by climbing Babe's tail, but all efforts to patch up the tank were in vain. So the old tank was abandoned and replaced by one of the new ones. This was the beginning of the Mississippi River. And the truth of this is established by the fact that the old Mississippi is still flowing. One day, when Paul and Babe were very tired, they walked on down the way, Paul dragging his pickaxe behind him in the dirt. The trail that pickaxe left can be seen in the dirt still today. Today we call it the Grand Canyon. Many folklorists call this story fake lore, because the story became popularized not through oral traditional circles, but through the advertising of the Red River Lumber Company. In 1914, the company hired a writer named William Lawhead to develop stories that would promote the logging industry. The legend of Paul Bunyan hit the presses in 1916, and it was later revamped in 1922 as The Marvelous Exploits of Paul Bunyan. Now, this fake lore was part of a story generated to seem as if it were circulated in older folklore. But instead, it was the creation of enterprising individuals with an agenda to increase sales and business for the logging industry. Now, while folklorists correctly call this a commercial product and a product of chambers of commerce, there's evidence that this story may have been based in early literary stories from the medieval French writer François Rabelais, who wrote about Gargantua and Pantagruel, two huge giants, one of which was so large he had an entire civilization living in his mouth. Talk about a tall tale. But Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox are gentle giants, not man-eaters. They march forward, promoting not only the logging industry, but promoting the dominant values of that time period in American culture: progress, expansion, and development. Paul Bunyan is arguably the most famous American folk hero. However, some folklorists say that the most famous American folk song is John Henry, in all of its many variants. And Google it, look it up, you'll find lots of different versions of this song. John Henry was a legendary African-American folk hero who worked on the railroads when the United States was beginning to connect itself with tunnels and rail lines. He is imagined, like Paul Bunyan, as a heroic giant of a man. John Henry is the story of a strong African-American steel-driving man who blasted tunnels through the mountains faster than steam-powered machines could. And it illustrates a time when our nation was coming into the age of steel and seeing the growth of the railroad industry. The legend is about a contest between John Henry, who drove steel spikes by hand into a mountain in order to set blasting charges, and dynamite to blast through the mountain for the building of the railway tunnel. Well, the race began. John Henry hammering spikes, and the steam-powered hammer through the mountain. And at the end, John Henry won. But the victory was a sad one, because he had exhausted himself to the point of death. His heart gave out from the effort of trying to beat that machine, and he died with the hammer in his hand. The era of mechanization in American history, this was an era of change. And stories like John Henry were inspired by the tension between people who had labored by hand and who were afraid that machines would put them out of work. In some cases, the machines just made the work more efficient, so more laborers could be hired to do more work. But in many cases, the machines could work harder and faster than a person. And many people were put out of work at the advent of new technology. Let's hear the ballad of John Henry.
When John Henry was a little lad, a-holding of his papa's hand, said, if I live until I'm 21, I'm gonna make a steel-driving man. I'm gonna make a steel-driving man. As Johnny said when he was a man, he made his words come true. He's the best steel driver on the C&O road. He belongs to the steel-driving crew. He belongs to the steel-driving crew. I hear the walking balls coming, coming on down the line. I thought I heard that walking ball say, Johnny's in that tunnel number 9. Johnny's in that tunnel number 9. John Henry standing on the right-hand said, the steam drill standing on the left. He says, I'll beat that steam drill down, or I'll die with the hammer on my breast. Or I'll die with the hammer on my breast. He placed his drill on the top of the rock, the steam drill standing by his side. He beat that steam drill 1.5 inches, and he laid down his hammer and he died. And he laid down his hammer and he died. Johnny said just before he died, I hope I'll meet you up above. You take my hammer and you wrap it in gold, and you give it to the girl I love. And you give it to the girl I love.
John Henry's death is a symbolic one. In one sense, it represents the death of jobs in the face of mechanization. There's an unusual folk song in American oral traditions that celebrates the advent of mechanization. It's about the mechanization of the shoe industry. Now, up until about the 1840s, shoes were made by hand. And one of the main hand tools used for making shoes was an awl. Now, an awl has a wooden handle and a pointed metal end used for piercing through shoe leather. My own great-grandfather had one like it. He would use it to repair his shoes. Now, for the type of awl that this song talks about, the top of the awl would be flat so that you could hammer it into the shoe leather and make a hole through which you could fit a tiny little wooden peg. Hence the name pegging awl, or as the song goes, peg and awl. And if you have a nice pair of shoes, ones with a leather heel on them, you might turn them over and you can see the peg holes made by the awl and the little wooden pegs or plastic pegs that hold the heel onto the sole of the shoe. Now, a long time ago, this was a lot of work. See if you would be happy about the machine that saved you a lot of time in this song, Peg and Awl.
In the year of 1801, peg and awl. In the year of 1801, peg and awl. In the year of 1801, peg and shoes was all I done. Hand me down my peg and awl. In the year of 1802, peg and awl. In the year of 1802, peg and awl. In the year of 1802, peg and shoes was all I do. Hand me down my my peg and all. They invented a new machine, peg and all. They invented a new machine, peg and all. They invented a new machine, prettiest thing I ever seen. Throw away my peg and all. Pegs 100 pair to my one peg and all. Pegs 100 pair to my one peg and all. Pegs 100 pair to my one peg and shoes, it ain't no fun. Throw away my peg and all. In the year of 18 and 3, peg and all. In the year of 18 and 3, peg and all. In the year of 18 and 3, new machine, it set me free. Throw away my peg and all.
The machine that this song refers to is probably one called the lasting machine. It was invented in 1883 by an African-American shoemaker, Jan Matzeliger. By 1885, his machine was making 150 to, some people say, 700 pairs of shoes a day. Now, just like the song was probably about a pegging awl, and we now say the song is peg and awl, the song's dates of 18 and 1 could just have easily have originally been 1881 to match with the dates that Matzeliger's lasting machine began to peg 100 to my one, hand by hand. But it's folklore, so who knows? In any case, the song is a counterpoint to other industrialization folk songs, such as John Henry, where the speed of industry can literally kill you. Do you ever feel like the pace of your world is going way too fast, like a train flying down the tracks? Railroads feature prominently in American folklore songs, including another traditional ballad about a legendary engineer who pushed his engine to the limit, flying down the track at top speed. Casey Jones was an actual person, an engineer who drove way too fast, and what do you think happened to him? Casey's friend, Wallace Saunders, composed a ballad in memory of Casey's story, and it goes like this.
Come all you rounders if you want to hear the story of a brave engineer. Casey Jones was that rounder's name. On a 6-8 wheeler, boy, he won his fame. The caller called Casey at 4:30. He kissed his wife at the station door. He mounted to the cabin with his orders in his hand, took his farewell trip to the promised land. Casey Jones mounted to his cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones mounted to his cabin, and he took his farewell trip to the promised land. He looked at his water, and his water was low. He looked at his watch, and his watch was slow. He turned to his fireman, and this is what he said: boy, we're gonna reach Frisco, but we'll all be dead. Casey Jones, I'm gonna drive her, Casey Jones, till she leaves the rail. Casey Jones, I'm gonna drive her, for I'm 8 hours late with that western mail. When he pulled up that Reno hill, he whistled for the crossing with an awful shrill. The switchman knew by the engine's moan that the man at the throttle was Casey Jones. Casey Jones, 2 locomotives, Casey Jones, going to bump. Casey Jones, 2 locomotives, Casey Jones said you'd better jump. Casey said just before he died, there's 2 more roads that I'd like to ride. The fireman said, which ones can they be? The Northern Pacific and the Santa Fe.
Tall tales and legends inflate characters and situation. Everything gets bigger in a tall tale. And many legendary characters and ballads focus on the shifting points between old and new cultures, the transition points in a society's way of life, as with the shift in mechanization and the railways or the early settlers' push to move out west. Now, in terms of mechanization, the story of evolving technology is a very old one that rings true in contemporary society. Every year we see a new iPhone or a smart device, a more lifelike TV screen image, or a better kind of computer coming out to outpace and outdo the previous models. Tall tales give legendary heroes the added strength and heft a culture needs in order to survive the winds of change. They give us a fictional platform on which we can stand and laugh with or at the impossible circumstances that surround us. When the winds of change blow like a tornado, who wouldn't want to lasso change around the middle and ride it off into the sunset? When death comes whistling down the tracks, the rhythm of a ballad or a song, well, it helps us ride those tracks on down the line to our story's next stop.